I'm really pleased about how things went today. I feel like there was a lot of thoughtful response, and I could say for myself that I spent much more time thinking about the Ritva and Rashi and these matters, much more than I would have, and I hope for some of you that was the case too. That the point of all this is to spark conversation and to try to think a little more deeply about these things that we're learning in the daf. So really, congratulations to everybody, and we should only continue to grow with each other further into the future. Okay, so here's a solution video where I give my spin, and let's first reiterate a little bit. Now let's look at the first problem I spoke about, expound on that a little bit here. The first problem we raised, you definitely need to watch the previous video to get the basic setup of what we're discussing here. But we spoke about that the Ritva comes up with a new understanding. He tells us that there's this very specific, specialized type of neder here. He fits this into a concept that he calls a nidre hegdish, a neder of a mitzvah, and he's doing that to deal with, what's the issue? Why does the Gemara imagine that the person wouldn't be bound if a guy says, I want to fast, who cares for how long? Then a vow is a vow. We take vows very seriously, For many of us, every other thing we say in conversation is b'li neder. There's a reason for that. There's a legitimate reason for that. We're very scared of bal yachel devaro. A person is bound by his word. So, if the guy says, I want to fast, who cares for how long? Why shouldn't that bind him? So, to deal with this, the Ritva suggests that we're talking about this very specific type of ned, this nidre hegdish, and it's connecting to a mitzvah. It's more like a shavua, and therefore, unless in this specialized neder the person is describing what we very specifically mean when we talk about a mitzvah of a Taanis, which entails arguably a substantial inui affliction, it doesn't bind him. So, to me, Rashi doesn't seem to be going with this. But when Rashi explains the issue, he simply says, Kabbalah's Taanis ze eno Kabbalah. Being a makabel, a fast like this, where there's only Sha'os, only for a few moments or hours, isn't a Kabbalah. We started to speak about this idea of a prerequisite. You have to formally accept, fast on yourself beforehand. So Rashi just very, almost like offhandedly, matter-of-factly, says that's not a Kabbalah. If the thing he is taking on is fasting for a few hours, it just, Rashi sounds like he's saying it's nothing. It doesn't get off the ground. It's hard for me to believe that Rashi agrees with the Ritva, that it's this whole, this very specific neder that we're dealing with, and because of that, it fails to comply with the particular rules of that type of neder. Rashi sounds like, from Rashi it appears that we're missing something very basic, and that's why it doesn't go into effect. So, I'd like to suggest that according to Rashi, there's something else that's going on over here. Look, we started the conversation with the idea of a neder, and when you read the Ritva, you get the sense that, basically the essence of what we're talking about is a vow, and the question is, why do the rules that this vow operates by, why do they differ here? Manishtana havow hazem mikol other vows. I'd like to suggest that according to Rashi, the essence of what we're talking about here is not a vow. The vow is more a means to an end. It's the outer shell, if you will. The engine, the real guts of what we're talking about, according to Rashi, is a Taanis. There's almost like an entity called a Taanis, and the objective here is taking that thing called Taanis, and the person wants to put that on his shoulders, if you will. The analogy for this is a nazir. The truth is, when somebody promises to be a nazir, he's making a vow. But ask yourself, is a vow really where the action is? Is the essence of what's happening when a guy becomes a nazir, that he's making a vow? I think not. I think instead, the essence of what's happening is there's something called nazirus, and he's pulling that concept called nazirus out of the air and putting that on himself. He's being mekabel nazirus. So what I'm suggesting is that there's something different conceptually, according to Rashi, between being mekabel something and vowing something. We talked about in the opening, the setup video, you can vow whatever you want. You could vow no chocolate cake for 5 seconds. Sure, that's fine. Here, we're not talking about, when we say the word mekabel, we're not discussing a generic vow. We're talking about taking this thing called a Taanis, and the person wants to put that on himself. So going to the analogy of Nazirus. So I was thinking, we remember from the, every year we're matir, we do a Tars Nadarim for Rosh Hashanah, and in that text, it's very technical, a lot of halachic language we mention, and we're not makabel Nazir Shimshin. So there's different forms of Nazir, of course. So what if a person said, I'm makabel myself Nazirus of Donald Trump? So we all probably agree that it's not going to go anywhere. It doesn't do anything. In other words, once we put in this framework, and I think we were all kind of saying this kind of concept in the feedback in Slack, everybody was, I think a lot of us were going in this direction, which is to say, intuitively we understand that when it comes to certain processes in halacha, you have to describe it correctly. That's kind of the moral of the story here. If you could accept this framework we're doing for Rashi, it goes without saying, it's obvious that if you're not describing what is defined, what the halacha dictionary defines as a Taanis, that it's totally useless. It doesn't do anything. It's like saying, I want to have Nazirus of Donald Trump go on me, which probably doesn't do anything. And so this sort of ties in with the other question having to do with, I really struggled going through this sugya. It just kept on coming back, and it just bothered me perpetually, this whole Kabbalah business. Like, why? I use the opinion of mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavana, but really just on a basic fundamental level, it just struck me as very unusual that there's this very rigid and particular requirement to accept on yourself, especially according to Rav, you have to do it at Mincha. It seems like this slight window to get your Kabbalah in, and it seems to sort of go against how most things work in Halacha, which is very action-oriented. Obviously, on a spiritual level, intention is quite important, but we're talking about dry, technical Halacha. So, I had a lot of difficulty with it, but certainly for going with Rashi and the Ritva as well, really, we're now, at least I'm getting a better sense of that, no, it makes sense. If you go with Rashi, for instance, that we're pulling out of the air this thing called the Taanis, and the person's pulling that and putting it on himself, well then of course that makes perfect sense. Yeah, there's a Kabbalah. It's not like putting on tefillin, right? You're taking something out of the halachic atmosphere and you're putting it on yourself. So how do you do that? It's not by just going through the motions and fasting, and it was very nice to see everybody was sharing similar thoughts. Yeah, you wake up and you're fasting, we intuitively, it sounds like that's not really a fast. And I think especially if we go with this framework, it makes sense that there is a way, it's a specific way to get that Taanis on yourself through a Kabbalah. And Rav and Shmuel debate how that Kabbalah works exactly. And I think to just finish off, we could also, and many were sharing this feedback too, we could look at this more from a hashkafic, philosophical point of view. And a lot of the Gemaras that we're seeing lately, when it deals with, what's the purpose of all these fasts, and the point is made over and over, the greatest example being the Anshe Ninveh, how a fast in particular is really just a means to an end. And that end, of course, is tshuva. Hashem is not looking at the outward actions nearly as much as, are we actually changing ourselves through the fast? So in that light as well, it makes sense, that sort of comes into the halacha. Of course, every mitzvah has a purpose. It's supposed to change us. One of my rebbeim used to say, from the way he would sort of explain the chinuch, Sefer HaChinuch's point of view is, we are what we do. And that's the whole point of all the mitzvahs, but especially, we could say that especially when it comes to a fast, it's really just a means to an end of tshuva. And so yes, you need that Kabbalah, even if you end up fasting the whole day, unless you were makabel on yourself to do this fast, to fulfill this new personal fast that you're putting on yourself. And again, from the halachic point of view, you're taking that from the air and putting it on yourself. Or if we go with the Ritva, it's this special kind of neder that you're connecting to the mitzvah. However exactly you describe the mechanics, it makes sense from a halachic point of view and from a hashkafic point of view that you have to have that mindset, that mentality of beforehand, before you start, connecting what you're about to do with the purpose, connecting it with the halachic concept of a Taanis. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.